Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stephanie Bonnick. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach here at the National First Ladies Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. I'm so glad that you could join us today for our legacy lecture, The Kentucky Todds in the White House with Donna McCreary. As we usually do in the past, please feel free to put into the chat where you're joining us from today. As we go throughout the program, if you do have questions for myself, the institution, or for our presenter today, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box. To get us started, I want to introduce what our program is going to be a little bit more about and a little bit more about our speaker today. So Donna McCreary is a writer, lecturer, and performer. She wrote Mary Lincoln Demystified, Frequently Asked Questions About Abraham's Wife, which was published in 2022. She also wrote Lincoln's Table, Victorian Recipes from Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois to the White House, as well as an essay in the Frank J. Williams and Michael Berkheimer's edited collection, The Mary Lincoln Enigma. Under her own imprint, Lincoln Presentations, she has published Fashionable First Lady, The Victorian Wardrobe of Mary Lincoln, The Kentucky Todds in Lexington Cemetery, and an expanded edition of her recipe book, Lincoln's Table, A President's Culinary Journey from Cabin to Cosmopolitan. She also lectures at Lincoln sites, museums, and libraries such as ours, and from 1992 until 2012, she portrayed Mary Lincoln herself. She is a co-founder of the Mary Lincoln's Coterie. She is the recipient of the Outstanding Mary Lincoln Award through the Association of Lincoln Presenters, the Lincoln Legend Award, Association of Lincoln Presenters, and a Best in History Superior Achievement Scholarly Books from the Illinois State Historical Society that was awarded to her just last year. Today, she'll be talking a little bit more about the complex identity that is Mary Lincoln. As many of you know, she was married to the great emancipator and who represents the North during a time of true conflict in America, but she does have a Southern birth. So you're going to be learning a little bit more about her family. And this discussion will examine many members of the Todd family who actually came to Washington while she was in the White House. Some were successful in their quest with visiting with her, but overall, as I'm sure you can imagine, their presence created some inner turmoil for the Lincoln family and gave the newspapers quite a bit of fodder for their gossip columns. So today, I'm going to hand things over to Donna McCreary. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section. Thank you so much, Donna, for being here with us this morning.
It is my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me. I have been looking forward to this. So to begin with explaining the Todd family, there's an old story that Abraham used to tell, and historians have continued to tell. And it's that Lincoln turned to his guest and said, "Governor Todd, my wife is a Todd. All of her kinsmen are Todds, but they all spell their name with 2 D's. You are the first Todd I've ever met who spells it with 1. And Governor Todd quickly responded, "Well, if 1 T is good enough for God, it's good enough for me." And the guest was Governor David Todd, T-O-D, of Ohio. Now, historians and authors have kind of finessed the story a little bit. They've changed it. Some saying that Lincoln told it as a joke to insult his wife. Some saying that Lincoln used the story to suggest that the Todd family members thought they were superior than any other family. And many historians have even suggested that Lincoln originated the joke, but he did not. However, he probably did tell this story as a way to tease his wife, Mary, and her family. It's very easy to imagine Lincoln having breakfast with Mary's relatives at the White House and jokingly saying, "Did I tell you what Governor Todd said to me the other day?" It's not known if Lincoln truly used this story to insult the entire Todd family. And it's doubtful that he did, for Lincoln knew what the Todds knew. As soon as he married Mary Todd, Lincoln became one of them, even though at times they did not accept him. The Todd family became more important to Lincoln's life than his own family did. In many ways, he aspired to be like them. He desired to be accepted by them. Various members of Mary's family had settled new lands. They had fought wars. They had developed cities, established institutions of higher learning. They wrote laws. They preached God's word and law. They were religious. They were educated, well-mannered. They were wealthy. The Todds were the aristocracy. As a friend of mine often says, before America had the Kennedy clan, America had the Todds. But these were the Todds. They were the Kentucky Todds, and Lincoln was surrounded by them. As author Stephen Barry once wrote, for all the important moments of his adult life, the births and deaths of his children, the success and failures of his career, there was always a Todd around to slap his back or squeeze his hand. And what the Todds also did, especially in the White House years, was to surround Lincoln with semi-scandals, which his political opponents were able to use against his family and his administration. Controversy between the Lincolns and the Todds began way before the Civil War. During the election of 1860, the Todd family members in Springfield supported Stephen Douglas for the presidency, not Abraham Lincoln. One can imagine the family position one can imagine when a family member gracefully explained this by saying, well, we were so surprised when he received the nomination, meaning Lincoln, for there were so many others better suited to the position. And this was said by Mary's full sister, Elizabeth Edwards. Much has also been written about the Kentucky Todds not voting for Lincoln, but we have to kind of look at the dynamics there a little bit. By the time the election rolled around, all of Mary's male relatives, or most of them, had left Lexington, with the exception of her brother Levi, who was a staunch supporter of both the Union and Lincoln. Now, the Todds may not have supported Lincoln during the election, but as soon as he was elected, the Todds began to line up to be near the president and his family, and the scandals quickly followed. When Abraham left Springfield, his traveling companions included Mary's cousin, Lockwood Todd. And when Mary left on a later train, she was accompanied by her cousin, Elizabeth Todd Grimsley, called Lizzie. She was also accompanied by her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, and Elizabeth's daughter, also named Elizabeth Edwards. And as the inaugural party made their eastward journey, they stopped along the way to meet well-wishers and to attend receptions to honor the president-elect. The accompanying Todds were having a wonderful time, and this is when the first family scandal broke. On February the 18th, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy. The press reported that 2 women in attendance were the toast of the Southerners, and these women were Mary's half-sisters, Mrs. Martha White and Miss Elodie Todd. Elodie had traveled to the South to visit with her married sister, Martha, and it was at the Davises' inaugural ball that Elodie met her future husband, Nathan H.R. Dawson, an officer in the Confederate services. The press was brutal, and they suggested that perhaps Mary's loyalties were far more Southern than Union. A few weeks later, when Lincoln took the oath of the presidency, he was surrounded by members of Mary's family. They were so abundant that one person commented that the White House was overran with Todds of the Edwards variety. Ninian Edwards had joined his wife Elizabeth and their daughter. Another daughter, Julia, and her husband, Edward L. Baker, had arrived. In addition, other Todd relative clan members at the inaugural included Mary's half-sister, Margaret Kellogg, and her husband, Charles, their cousin, John Blair Todd Smith, cousins Elizabeth Grimley and Lockwood Todd, who'd both traveled from Springfield, a Miss Todd of Kentucky, who we believe was Kitty, and several historians, even though several historians have speculated that the Miss Todd was Elodie, it's very doubtful since she had been president at the Davises' inaugural ball. I don't think she would have traveled from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., and then back. The Miss Todd was probably the youngest of the Todd girls, Catherine, sometimes called Kitty, who had been in Springfield visiting relatives at the time of the election. Most likely, she probably traveled with the Lincolns to Washington, although she's not mentioned in any of the press reports. Also mentioned by historians being on the inaugural journey is Mary's brother-in-law, William Wallace, who was married to Mary's sister, Frances. I know it's a lot of names. But his name also does not appear on the messages requesting rooms for the Lincolns at the Willard Hotel. Once settling in Washington, it was not long before the name Todd appeared in newspapers and in letters back home. Mary's niece, Julia Baker, this is Elizabeth Edwards' daughter, had come expecting to find herself the center of attention and the idolized Todd of the newspapers. She did not stay in Washington long after the inaugural. Elizabeth Grimsley wrote, quote, Julia Baker came expecting to set Washington ablaze by her elaborate wardrobe and elegance and found other things which were taken into consideration here. Julia returned to Springfield in a huff because she was upset she was not the belle of the ball. But there were still plenty of Todds to keep Mary company. Cousin Lizzie had just begun a 6-month stay with the Lincolns. And it's mostly from her letters home that we learn of the many Todds who were visiting Washington. Why were they there? Well, they wanted government jobs. And Lincoln obliged many. And by doing so, he caused the press to accuse him of nepotism. Mary was very offended by these charges, and she was very quick to point out that Lincoln had little family, neither a brother or a sister, and very few cousins. But she failed to comment on the number of her family members who were in Washington. In March of 1861, just days after the inauguration, Lizzie wrote, quote, the papers announced the presence of 100 Todds, and all wanting office. Just some of the friends and family who came along and seek employment included Mary's brother Levi. He came to Washington searching for a position. He didn't get it. Mary's cousin, Lyman Beecher Todd, was appointed postmaster in Lexington, Kentucky. Another distant relative, Thomas Campbell, the husband of Mary's first cousin Anne, lived in Missouri, and he was appointed postmaster in Boonville, Missouri. Another cousin, John Blair Smith Todd, tried to use his family connections to have William Jayne appointed governor of Illinois. He failed. But William Jayne was appointed as the first governor of Dakota Territory. Lincoln appointed his brother-in-law captain and commissionary of substance in Illinois, an appointment that he quickly regretted due to the numerous complaints about Ninian's scandalous behavior and filtering of funds. Ben Hardin Helm, a brother-in-law married to Sister Emily, arrived requesting to return to the Army. Lincoln offered Ben a position as the Army's paymaster with the rank of the major, but Ben declined, and he became a Confederate officer. Elizabeth Grimsley wished to be appointed postmaster in Springfield, and she was denied. These are a few of the many, and by the time Lincoln had finished handing out positions, the New York World newspaper was quick to criticize. In an unparalleled display of nepotism, the president has appointed his whole family to government positions. If it were not bad enough that the family was requesting positions for themselves, they're also requesting positions for their friends. Lizzie Grimsley wrote of how one morning she and Mary stormed Lincoln's office with a request. They had learned that the former pastor from Springfield, the Reverend James Smith, wished to return to his native land of Scotland, and that his family had sent a letter making the request. The two women encouraged Lincoln to make the appointment, and Lincoln did approve Reverend Smith as the consul of Glasgow. But it was probably that he would have made this appointment without the interference of the women. Cousin Lizzie stayed at the White House 6 months, and while her contribution to the White House daily life included helping Mary with the entertainment schedule, general household management, she also helped Mary create one of the greatest personal scandals of the Lincoln White House. When the Lincolns arrived at the president's house, as it was then called, a tour was in order. Mary and her female relatives, cousin Lizzie, sisters Elizabeth and Margaret, toured the executive mansion. As the ladies ventured from room to room, they found torn curtains, worn rugs, peeling wallpaper, falling plaster, broken furniture, and Lizzie claimed that the White House Lizzie claimed the furniture looked as if it had been there since the very first president, and that there was not enough china to host a proper table setting for a formal dinner party. Lizzie described the place as deplorable. She said it looked more like an old, ran-down, third-rate hotel than a home fit for a president. And to make matters worse, the entire place was dirty and smelly. And when the ladies descended into the basement, they were greeted by a colony of rats. The Todd women knew what must be done. Go shopping. Renovate the building. Lizzie accommodated Mary on her shopping trips to New York to help Mary choose the new items. See, her opinion was valued as Mary hunted for new drapes, china, furniture, books, amenities for the White House, and Lizzie made her own purchases for dresses, shawls, and laces. And Mary also did the same and increased her wardrobe. The two women were appalled when their shopping trips made front page news. Lizzie was defensive, saying the newspaper accounts were exaggerated and that they were accustomed of buying items that they never saw, or they were accused of buying items that they never saw, and patronizing stores where they never shopped. In the end, Mary overspent the appropriation for decorating the White House by more than $6,000. And after 6 months of shopping, redecorating, entertaining, and socializing, Lizzie returned to Springfield loaded with personal gifts from the Lincolns. Now, Mary alone had to answer for the bills and the vast amount of the purchases. The over expenditure gave the press and all future historians enough ammunition to criticize her into the current century. While in Washington, Lizzie felt that her presence and the presence of other family members helped Lincoln forget the problems of the world. Often as early as 5 a.m., he would find himself in the cabinet room. Mrs. Lincoln would send coffee to him there, and then around 9 or 10, he would come to breakfast with the family. Lizzie recorded that Lincoln often came looking sad or harassed. But amongst the family and the friends, he relaxed. It was at this time that he would say, "And this reminds me," and then he would spend time telling stories and jokes. Major William S. Wallace, Mary's brother-in-law, sister to Frances, was a frequent guest for breakfast when he was in town. And one morning, several members of the Springfield community were visiting, and one member of the party inquired if the story of John Todds Stewart, Mary's cousin, and Lincoln were known. The story was, the landlady in a certain town was particularly partial to both Stewart and Lincoln. After serving a comfortable supper, she turned to Major Stewart, a very handsome man, saying, "Stewart, how fine and pert you do look. But Lincoln, whatever have you been doing? You look powerful weak." "Nothing out of the common, ma'am," was his reply. "But did you ever see Stewart's wife? Or did you ever see mine? I tell you, whoever marries into the Todd family gets the worst of it." Now, this raised a laugh at Stewart's expense and at the other lawyers who all began running over the Todds in their heads and thinking about their spouses. And of all the large family connections, Major S. Wallace was the only portly one amongst them. Mr. Galloway thought the story was in questionable taste in the presence of the female members of the Todd family, but Mrs. Lincoln and her sister Elizabeth assured them that they were too well satisfied with Mr. Lincoln's affection for and appreciation of the Todds to care for a retort made under such exasperating circumstances. Now, historians have severely disagreed about the true meaning of this story. Some believe it's further proof that Lincoln loved neither his wife nor the Todds. Others claim that it's an inside, slightly off-colored comment with sexual undertones. Some think of it as nothing more than a joke about John Todd Stewart's weight. Whatever the intentions were, it was perceived at the time as a joke. And really, it should be considered as nothing more. Lizzie thought that during these times that the war and its pressures were forgotten. She found that the president was better rested, lighter hearted, and went into cabinet meetings from the breakfast table refreshed. Now, one of the major burdens for President Lincoln were all of those Confederate Todds. There were a bunch of them. Lincoln may have had his burdens lightened when some of the Todds visited the White House, but south of the Mason-Dixon line, the Todds created havoc. Mary's brothers, Sam, David, Alex, and George Rogers Clark Todd, had all joined forces to support Jefferson Davis. Two of Mary's sisters were living in Selma, Alabama, One was married to a Confederate officer, the other one was engaged to one. And dear Emily was married to Benjamin Hardin Helm, a Confederate officer with Kentucky's Orphan Brigade. The Lincolns had called Emily little sister. And when Ben had refused Lincoln's generous offer for a military position and leading Kentucky's Orphan Brigade against Union forces, the tensions politically and personally between the families caused Elodie Todd to write, "Surely there is no one so unfortunate at to be surrounded." No, I skipped something there. Caused Emily Todd to write, "Surely there is no other family in this land placed in the exact situation as ours, and I hope will never be one so unfortunate at to be surrounded by trials so numerous." But the biggest trial the family experienced was not just that their family drama was happening and causing havoc amongst the family, but that it was playing out in the news and often on the front page. Mary's brother, George Rogers Clark Todd, was the youngest of Mary's full siblings. Just days after he was born, their mother passed away. And at the onset of the war, George was in Richmond at the St. Charles Hotel. He caused such a scene by swearing at the Confederates and calling them traitors. But when searched, he had a letter written by Abraham Lincoln. George said it was a mistake, and then he considered Lincoln an unhung scoundrel. All this played out in the news. George, as a trained physician, was able to find a commission in a regiment, and he served in that position through the duration of the war. He was the only one of Mary's brothers to survive the war. Somewhat. Well, there's also David, but that's a little different. And even throughout Reconstruction and attempts to heal the country, George never stopped hating Abraham and Mary. Mary's half-brother Samuel moved to New Orleans. And as a private, he was shot and mortally wounded during the second day of the Battle of Shiloh. He died en route to a field hospital and was buried in a shallow grave alongside the road. Because sometimes news travels slowly during the war, the family was not notified of Sam's death until David was able to find the doctor who could confirm it. Once the press learned of Sam's death, the story was published in almost every single newspaper throughout the country. The northern papers were quick to point out that the First Lady's brother had died trying to overthrow her husband's government. The New Orleans Delta printed, quote, "It must be a pleasant reflection to Mrs. Abraham Lincoln amid her vulgar attempts to ape royal fashions with her balls and soirees at the federal Capitol, to know that a gallant brother should have thus fallen by the hands of her husband's mercenaries." No other death of a private received so much national press. Half-brother Alex joined the Confederacy as an aide-de-camp for his brother-in-law, Benjamin Hardin Helm. Before the Battle of Baton Rouge, some of the men were traveling down a dark road. No one knows exactly what happened. There was a noise. Horses were trampling down the road, and a shot rang out. It was only after both Ben and Alex were injured that the men firing the rifles realized they were shooting their own men. The men went ahead without Ben. He stayed behind to tend to his own wounds and to tend to Alex. Both men were carried to the Pratt farm, where Alex died and was laid to rest in the plum orchard. Once again, the press vilified Mary Lincoln. The Pittsburgh Sun reported, "Another brother of Mrs. Lincoln killed, and the White House is again in mourning. The wife of the President of the United States mourns the death of a brother killed while leading a rebel regiment against Union troops." The newspaper had Alex's rank and circumstances surrounding his death incorrect, and it's doubtful that they understood anything about Mary's mourning. According to Elizabeth Keckley, Mary's dressmaker, Mary had said, quote, "Well, of course, it is but natural that I should feel for one so nearly related to me, but not to the extent that you suppose. He made his choice long ago. He decided against my husband, and through him against me. He has been fighting against us, and since he chose to be our deadly enemy, I see no special reason why I should bitterly mourn his death." Mary's brother David was a bit unknown. He claimed he went to Washington as a spy and visited the Lincolns, where he pressed Abraham for government details. David claimed that Lincoln was never a suspect of his Confederate alignments and offered him a position as a minister to Brazil. Supposedly, federal detectives persuaded Lincoln to have David arrested, but David outwitted them all by asking to be able to attend a wedding in Georgetown before he was taken to jail. He then jumped in a hack, compelled the driver to take him to the Potomac River, crossed the river, escaped to Richmond, and joined the Confederate Army. It's a nice story, and that's all it is, but David was thrilled to tell it often. What we do know about David is that by May the 1st, he traveled to Selma to visit his sisters. He had reached the rank of first lieutenant and a promise to make captain within 3 months. David returned to Richmond, where he ran a prison, which had been constructed by converting tobacco warehouses. When 1,421 Union POWs were marched into the Richmond prison, David took a personal delight in the human blood and suffering. One prisoner recalled, there was something in David Todds' voice and manner that always indicated a desire to commit cruel wrong. David's own words gave insight to his violent nature. Instead of saying that he did not agree with Lincoln's politics or that he did not like the man, David would frequently say, quote, he wanted to cut his brother-in-law's heart out. David would often enter the prison with his sword drawn, and he would heave it until it was bloody. He struck an invalid in the face. He stabbed a prisoner in the thigh for not putting out a lamp fast enough. Under David's watch, prisoners were not allowed to use the latrine alone or after lights out. This resulted in lines as much as 25 feet long while men waited to use the facilities. Some went days without being taken to the latrine, and conditions quickly became deplorable. Prisoners in the upper areas of the White House, or the warehouses, had no bars on their windows. If a hand, arm, or head poked out, if a prisoner came too near the opening for a quick breath of fresh air, they were shot. The worst accusation against David was when the body of a deceased Union prisoner was dropped at David's door for burial. Instead of treating the deceased with respect and giving the body a proper burial, David kicked the body into a public street and left him. Until now, the Yankees, according to David, were considered less than human. They were vilified creatures who brought on the war of Northern aggression. But at this point, with David's horrible treatment, the Southerners were seeing just how inhuman their own could be. David was finally arrested for having acted contrary to the orders of the military department of Richmond. He was released of duty, and nearly every newspaper in America printed the story of David's conduct. When Mary heard of the treason of David's actions, she told a reporter that David should not escape punishment for his treason against the United States government. But the press did not tell the story of Mary's patriotism or her ill feelings towards David's actions. Instead, they used the press to present a negative image of Abraham and Mary as being rude, crude, uncouth people. According to the newspapers, of course Mary had to be a crude woman. Just look at what her brother did. The actions of this man surely are those of an insane man. Therefore, we can assume that his sister must be, and that's another story. Martha White, who was Mary's half-sister, claimed to have smuggled quinine to the Confederate territory. Later, family members came to her defense, saying that Martha never did such a thing. They wrote that what she truly smuggled was a new uniform for Robert E. Lee. There is no evidence that this statement is true. It is true that her trunk had a false bottom and that she herself bragged about smuggling medicine to the Confederate soldiers. Mary's cousin, Lizzie Grimsley, always believed that Martha was guilty and wrote, quote, the sister A wonderfully bright and prepossessing woman from Alabama won hearts and confidence and went through the lines carrying her weight almost in quinine, a bonanza to the Southern Army. Moreover, adding insult to injury by telling with great vim the story of her outwitting her too credulous brother Lincoln. Close quote. Mary could not forgive the behavior, and orders were given that her Southern relatives should not be permitted to enter the house. Any and all correspondence from them should be placed by the secretary in the wastebasket. To be sure that none of their letters got through to Mary by concealing them with other mail, all of Mary's letters were opened by her secretary. The most known semi-scandal created by the Todds was the appearance of a Confederate general at the White House in December of 1863. The rebel in the White House. Mary's half-sister, Emily Todd, the wife of Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Todd, was in Georgia when General Helm was killed during the Battle of Chickamauga. Her mother had come from Kentucky to help Emily return home. At Fortress Monroe, Emily was told she had to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. She refused. She felt that it would have been an insult to her husband's memory, and not knowing what to do with this young widow, Lincoln was contacted, and he responded, "Send her to me." There was a great sadness when Emily arrived. Lincoln had offered Ben a position in the Army as a paymaster with an annual salary of $3,000 a year. It was the highest position Lincoln could give without congressional approval. He even offered Ben a position at a Western post if he wished to remain neutral during the war. Lincoln would have preferred that Ben remain in Washington so the two sisters could remain close, but Ben refused. And even though he realized it was the best offer he could obtain in the Union Army, he chose to fight for the Confederacy. And now his wife was a widow with 3 small children. Both of the women were heartbroken. Politics had come between them in a manner which now made them political enemies. But still, the love between the sisters was strong. And during Emily's 2-week stay, she managed to offend both General Dan Sickles and Senator Ira Harris with her quick temper and her Southern loyalties. Both men found it scandalous that a Confederate widow was staying at the White House. Family or not, it did not matter. During the 2 weeks, Emily and Mary never discussed the war or politics. And when Emily left, she had an invitation to return and a note saying her property was to be left alone with the exceptions of her enslaved persons. The Lincolns were very gracious to her. They were willing to forget some of the past to preserve a small portion of the family, but it was just not to be. Just as the Todds had lined up to seek government positions in the Lincoln presidency, Emily wanted a handout. In 1864, Emily demanded that Lincoln give her a license to sell 600 bales of cotton. He may have granted it if Emily could have taken the oath of allegiance, but she would not, so the request was denied. Emily then wrote a seething letter to Lincoln saying that she had, quote, used up all her money to go on her long, tedious, unproductive, and sorrowful visit to the White House. She continued by blaming Lincoln for the deaths of her husband, her brothers, and the death of her brother Levi from want. Remember, Lincoln did not give Levi one of those coveted governor positions, and he died a poor man, or so Emily claimed. She stated that Levi died from utter want and destitution, another sad victim of the more favored relatives. Then she penned the words that Mary Lincoln could and would never forgive, quote, "I also remind you that your many balls have made us what we are." Close quote. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I may be a slow walker, but I never walk back." Mary took this course, for she never spoke to, saw, or wrote to her sister Emily again. Mary had endured criticism from friends, from political and military personnel when she supported Emily. She suffered from an onslaught of accusations in the newspapers, And it was one thing when they accused her of being crude based on David's behavior, but when the press accused Mary of being a Confederate spy when Emily came to Washington, Mary was the victim of gossip among members of Washington society because of Emily's visit. Mary endured verbal abuse, inaccurate accusations, social ostracism because she opened the White House doors to a Confederate widow. In Mary's opinion, how dare this little twit blame her and her husband for the death of loved ones? It was too much for Mary to bear. And worst of all, it all played out in the press. Imagine if any of this happened in today's world with social media. What would national news, media, talk radio hosts, and other conservative commentary do today if anything close to these semi-scandals had occurred? All right. So at this point, I guess I am opening up for questions, and I know there's a way to see them. Oh. Someone asked, do you support the theory that Mary may have had pernicious anemia? Is that the one that's the vitamin B deficiency?
Yes.
Okay. It's about back with yes. Here's my general theory on diagnoses. We live in a century that has medical knowledge that they did not, and we do not have a body. We do not have any way of really testing that. I think because of diet back then, I think because of nutrition that we know now that we didn't know back then, I would say anything is possible in that respect. But I don't think there is enough information about what we do and do not know about Mary's health at the time. I go with what we do know. We do know that she had diabetes. There are medical charts that say she had diabetes. And I'm going to say this real quick about looking at historical research. You're going to find in historical research, you're going to find contradictory information. There are many, many reports out there that when Mary died, they discovered a brain tumor. This is false. They did not discover a brain tumor. There was no autopsy. So, to say that she had a brain tumor, to say that she had a cancer, there's no way of knowing.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that, Donna. And I will say, in general, Donna makes some wonderful points. And one of the things we interpret at our site is anything about Ida McKinley's health. And in modern terms, we would say she probably struggled with epilepsy, but it looks very different in the era in which she lives. And they're not recording it to the same extent with the modern language that we do today. So that's wonderful questions. We've got a couple more, Donna, coming into the Q&A section. So was there any reconciliation with the family after the war?
No.
No.
No, not with the Confederate family, no. Now, let me go back down to another generation, or into another generation. When you look at Robert Todd Lincoln, Mary's son, he did reconcile. He and Emily became very, very close. I have a whole lecture about Robert and Emily, because what he ends up doing, Robert, of course, was a very wealthy man, and he ends up embracing a lot of the Confederate family, and Emily becomes the spokesperson. So she's writing letters to Robert saying, oh, Mrs. Canfield, and this is Robert's first cousin, she's so poor, she's so destitute, she can't afford coal to heat her house this winter. And what does Robert do? He is in charge of the Pullman Car Company. He has a trainload of coal delivered to Mrs. Canfield's home. Emily was right. I have been to the home that Emily lived in Lexington, Kentucky. It's a mansion. They had a large farm. They were making good money. Her son supported the entire family, basically, and he worked for the railroad company. Her daughter was a very famous and sought after portrait or artist, and they all lived together in this one house. So they have their own income. Robert is sending them money on a regular basis. And every year on Emily's birthday, he sent her $1,000. Now we're talking the 1920s. He's sending $1,000 to Aunt Emily. So it's he sort of takes on the role of trying to support, everybody. And then George Rogers Clark, Todd, who Mary's brother, who absolutely hated Abraham Lincoln, his son needed a job, and Robert got him a job with the train company. And George Jr. was so ecstatic, he named one of his children after Robert Todd Lincoln. And so did Mary have that reconciliation? No. Did her son Robert? Absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. And one of the comments was that from Camille that unfortunately Mary Lincoln has been unfairly treated in history, which I think we can agree with at the site. I think Donna, you would agree with that as well based on our previous conversations,
Yes.
which actually ties in very well to one of our questions, just something that unfortunately her reputation in history has been that she is insane. And we know that, again, modern conceptions of mental health and wellness are very different at this time. So the question that came posed was she actually genuinely insane at the end of her life? And what happened in that mental hospital?
I wrote quite a bit about this in Mary Lincoln Demystified. If we just look at the word insane, was Mary Lincoln insane? We have to say yes, because at that time in history, to be declared insane, you went into a court of law. It's a legal term, just as it is now. I think what people really want to know is, did she truly have mental illness? And, nobody's ever going to agree. People talk about manic depression. They talk about bipolarism. They talk about, a lot of modern terms that we have now. Depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome. She could have suffered from any of those. But what happened is Robert didn't like the way Mary was spending her money, because she was spending it frivolously. She was buying things that she was never going to use. She was a shopaholic. There's no doubt about that, I don't think. The bills are there to prove it. She bought lavish gifts for people. And she was having periods of talking about Lincoln as if he were really there, talking to him, talking about, I'm not so sure we would consider that mental illness in today's society. I know a lot of people who go to the cemetery and stand by the grave and talk. So yeah, that was pretty tough. She did suffer from paranoia. She was very afraid of fire. Understandable. She was in Chicago during the Great Fire. She lived at a different time than what we live in as far as women's rights and what women could and could not do on their own. So Robert has her arrested. Robert has her committed. Robert puts her in Bellevue rest home or sanitarium, whatever you want to call it. And everybody thought she'd be there for the rest of her life, and she was out in 3 months. Maybe what she had too was a little bit of dementia. There's no way of actually knowing what was going on in that head, except I don't think she had a brain tumor. I'm trying to look to see what the messages are here.
In the Q&A we've got, did the cousins have any close friendships?
Close friendships? Oh, you mean with Mary? Is that? Yes, absolutely. Mary was very close to her cousin Anne. Anne was the daughter of David Todd, who was a judge in Missouri. And Anne was very popular. She was a very popular young lady in Missouri. And Mary went to stay with her for a while, her Uncle David and Anne. Once she went to Springfield, she courted Lincoln for a while, and then they kind of broke up, and Mary went to Missouri, and there was, a reconciliation later. So she was very close to Anne. She was extremely close to Elizabeth Grimsley. She was extremely close to John Todd Stewart. John had a sister whose name has just left me, and she was very close to her. Woodrow. She ended up marrying Woodrow. I can't remember her first name. Margaret, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look that one up. But yes, they had very, very close cousins. Lots of cousins.
Thank you. I have another question. Did she die in poverty, and how did she support herself? I imagine that's following the assassination.
She did not die in poverty. She was a Todd. She had quite a bit of money, and she supported herself by a couple of things. One was Robert, because she was a woman and because the year was the 1870s to the 1880s, Robert had control of her money. So he was investing it, and he was making good money for her off of her interest on her bonds. And then she received a pension from the government for being the wife of a president. $3,000 a year, I think it was.
I've got one in the regular chat.
I knew this was going to happen.
Well, she continues to be one of the most popular and mysterious first ladies in American history. Yeah. So someone said, I have read that Mary and Abraham had a lively love of politics and debating together as part of their relationship. Do we hear about any family gatherings observed that they would have engaged in this kind of banter? What about at their time at the White House?
Well, I think the times that I was talking about in the White House, where they all had breakfast together every morning, that was definitely a lot of political banter. But Mary and Abraham definitely had political banter. She did. I do want to say about her, though, she did not go to the political debates with Stephen Douglas, except for the very last one that was in Alton, and that was the one where she said that Douglas was such a little giant next to her tall Kentuckian. But politics was, obviously it was a very huge part of their lives. While Mary knew how to campaign, she knew how to entertain. They were constantly surrounded by politicians. So many members of the Todd family were politicians. It was very, very political family.
And to go along with that, could you talk a little bit more about her relations with other first ladies?
I don't know that she really had a relationship with any other first lady. She didn't like the Johnsons at all. She never went back to Washington for anything other than Robert's wedding. I don't think she would have had any. And you have all those years before her where there wasn't a first lady, and Verena Davis, was filling in as the hostess of the White House. Of course, she wouldn't have had a relationship with her since she was married to Jefferson Davis, but I don't think she had relationships with other first ladies.
Okay, I think that might be all of our questions. The ones that I could answer in the chat, I did, Donna. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank you again for joining us this morning, depending on where you're zooming in, or afternoon, if it's already afternoon, as it is here in Ohio. So if you have any other questions that we didn't get to answer, feel free to just email me. I'm putting my email in the chat, and I will ensure that they get to Donna. You can also, please do visit her site, check out Mary Lincoln Demystified. It's a wonderful book. She's even sent me a couple snippets of it as well. It really is extraordinary, and she is quite the expert on Mary Lincoln. So thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your day. Have a wonderful weekend. Again, Donna, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I thoroughly have enjoyed it. This is my getting back into doing things since the tragedies of my life. So yes, I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I hope we get to do this again sometime. We'll talk just about Mary Lincoln.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much. Have a good weekend.
Okay, thank you. You too.
Thank you.